Every wedding anniversary, my husband and I take a set of photos together. Of course, the 10th anniversary was no exception. While the studio staff was helping me look through the pictures, they suddenly spoke up. "Oh, we missed a few photos of your husband, they're right here." I glanced at the photos. My husband is my husband, but the one wearing the wedding dress isn't me, it's his secretary, Emily. The studio staff began showing me the photos one by one. My husband is my husband, but the one in the wedding dress isn't me, it's his secretary, Emily. The couple in the photos looked perfect together, as if they were made for each other. The groom appeared mature and charming, while the bride was young and beautiful, gazing up at the groom with starry eyes. The shop owner, who was bringing me a frame, walked over, saw the photos, and her expression changed immediately. She quickly reached out to close the folder on the computer and scolded the staff sharply. "This is a mistake. This person just looks like Mr. Jonathan, how could it possibly be him? Mr. Jonathan and Mrs. Jonathan are our regular customers, there's no way to mix them up. Don't even think about your bonus this month." The staff member realized they were in trouble and didn't dare speak. I smiled and tried to smooth things over. "It's okay, they turned out really well. I'll help my husband get his photos too, and I can just message him about it." I picked a few photos that I thought were the best of the two and sent them to Jonathan. "I think you and Emily look the best in these, so I took the liberty of choosing them for you." Jonathan immediately called me, anxiously explaining over the phone. "Don't misunderstand, dear. That day was Emily's birthday, and she said she wanted to take some photos to deal with her parents' marriage pressure. It's all fake, don't take it seriously." A birthday wish to take wedding photos with your boss? Can you believe that? The president of the Jonathan Group took wedding photos for his secretary's birthday wish? You could really be nominated as one of the 10 most touching figures in City A. I hung up the phone. Thinking it over, I opened Emily's Moments. Sure enough, she had just posted wedding photos from yesterday with the caption, "Is there anyone more perfect than us?" The comments were filled with exclamations. "Your husband is so handsome. Such a perfect match, you two look amazing together." Some who knew the inside story liked the post. "Only you would have Jonathan willing to go along with your nonsense. You really are Jonathan's favorite." Emily replied below, "Not yet a husband, I'll work hard." Youthful, proud, and brimming with confidence, she had the attitude that nothing could stop her and she had to win. If it weren't for her interest in Jonathan, I might actually admire her boldness. I typed a comment and liked her post. "If you two look this good together, why aren't you getting married? Is the Civil Affairs Bureau too far away?" Jonathan's call came as no surprise, laced with fury. "Catherine, what do you mean?" I explained that it was just a joke. "Do you really have to get into a fight with a little girl over this?" Replying to her comments. "Do you know how hard you've made it for her at the company? You need to delete that comment right away and apologize to Emily at the office." In the background, I heard Emily's voice, sniffling. "Catherine, I'm really sorry, I didn't mean it. Taking wedding photos was my birthday wish, I thought it was just a joke, I didn't realize you would care. We often joke like this at our age, I forgot you're quite a bit older than me and might not like it. It's all my fault. I'll call the studio right away to destroy those photos, I'm sorry." Jonathan's anger only escalated. "Listen, Emily is 10 years younger than you, and she's more considerate. She's crying and still apologizing to you. What about you? You just bully her, you really have a lot of gall." I held back my anger and asked him over the phone. "Am I wrong in this? My husband is taking wedding photos with another woman, and I can't be angry, nor can I say anything about it, right? Maybe you should marry a deaf-mute so your wife will never know what you're doing." After saying this, I hung up the phone. Jonathan didn't come home until almost midnight, not saying a word, entering into silent treatment mode. After so many years of marriage, I know him too well. Whenever I upset him, he resorts to cold violence, refusing to talk or communicate until I lower my head. He thinks I will apologize to him like usual, after all, I love him so much. To be with him, I gave up the smooth path my family arranged for me and insisted on leaving my hometown to come to City A with him. Back then, he said, in City B, I'll always live under your parents' arrangements. If I succeed, people will say I relied on your family's influence, and I don't want that. Looking at his stubborn yet handsome face, my heart melted. So, I gritted my teeth and fought with my parents for a year, finally getting them to agree to let me leave my hometown with Jonathan. We started living in a basement, and now we reside in the most expensive villa area in City A. I thought we had everything, a good social standing and wealth, and Jonathan treated me very well, his heart and mind only on me. I thought my happiness was firmly in my grasp. But nobody told me that happiness could expire. It was when I found a pair of high heels under Jonathan's desk in his office that I realized something had quietly changed. I picked up the high heels and looked at Jonathan. He looked a bit embarrassed but also had a hint of clueless affection. Emily, that little scatterbrain, forgot to take them after changing shoes that day. A little secretary changes into high heels in the president's office? I laughed mockingly. Jonathan, be careful not to overstep your boundaries. He chuckled and called me petty. But gradually, I began to notice changes. The charm hanging in his car, which used to be the safety talisman I asked for, had transformed into a crystal favored by young girls. The cushions went from understated luxury in silver gray to a riot of colorful patterns. I knew that Jonathan's vows were beginning to fade. This time, he still wanted to use the cold treatment to make me back down. But I was tired, I didn't want to. The next morning, Jonathan was waiting for me. He stood at the dining table, his expression cold. You're coming to the office with me today. I looked at him in silence. He said, you need to apologize to Emily. You're Mrs. Jonathan, don't do things that don't match your identity. Jealous of a little secretary? That's quite something, I replied, placing the cup of milk on the table as I looked at him. All right, let me get a gift, then it'll seem more sincere. Jonathan's expression softened a little, and his tone became much gentler. Wouldn't it have been nice if you'd been this sensible yesterday? When we arrived at the office, Emily stood up as soon as she saw me, timidly calling out, Sister Catherine. Her eyelids were slightly puffy, likely from crying a lot in front of Jonathan the day before. A few other secretaries nearby were silently watching, ready to enjoy the spectacle. I smiled and stood in front of Emily, glancing at Jonathan. Yesterday, I said you two look perfect together, and I meant no harm. Jonathan asked me to apologize to you, and I thought it would be more appropriate to bring you a gift. Emily shook her head. No, it was my fault, it's all my mistake. Jonathan gently comforted her. Sister Catherine is here to apologize, so just accept her gift. I patted Emily's hand, opened the jewelry box, and took out a ring. The ring was surrounded by a circle of diamonds, breathtakingly beautiful. The secretaries watching gasped in unison. I placed the ring on Emily's ring finger and held it up for admiration. So pretty, it suits you perfectly. Do you like this gift? Jonathan's face changed dramatically from behind me. This ring was my wedding ring with him. Back then, he wasn't as successful as he is now, and this expensive ring nearly wiped out all his savings. At that time, he gave me all his love. Now, I didn't want his person or his love anymore. Emily looked at the diamond ring, her youthful face glowing with happiness, her eyes sparkling. She tilted her head toward Jonathan. Jonathan, this is too precious, I can't accept it. Jonathan stepped forward, grabbing my hand and, gritting his teeth, whispered, Catherine, what are you trying to do? I pulled my hand away, still smiling brightly. Wasn't this supposed to be an apology? I did what you asked. This ring is the most suitable, especially for wearing with a wedding dress. Your Emily will absolutely be the most beautiful bride, don't you think, Jonathan? Our wedding back then was very simple. It was our first year in City A, and we had nothing. We lived together in a damp basement and ate instant noodles together. Sometimes, when I came home late from working overtime at the office, I would drool at the smell of fried noodles from the street vendors. But the fried noodles cost 10 yuan a serving, and I couldn't bear to buy them. One day, Jonathan hugged me and cried, "Catherine, being with me has made you suffer. You're a young lady, why do you have to do this? Why don't you just go home? When I succeed, I'll come back to marry you." I covered his mouth. "Don't say that again, I'm determined to be with you." He took out some change from his pocket, counted it to 10 yuan, and bought a serving of fried noodles. We sat on a small stool, each taking a bite. That was the most delicious fried noodle I've ever had. The following year, as the company's business improved, Jonathan proposed to me. When we went to register our marriage, we didn't even have a wedding dress. I wore just a tiny veil on my head, let alone take wedding photos. When we got the certificate, Jonathan's eyes turned red, and he made me a promise. "I will always treat you well. If I ever wrong you, let me be poor for life and never find happiness." Just then, a newlywed couple came out with their marriage certificate. The girl wore a beautiful wedding dress, and the diamond ring on her finger caught people's attention. Jonathan hung his head in shame, but soon he looked at me with determination. "I will make sure you wear the most beautiful wedding dress and the prettiest diamond ring. From now on, we'll take wedding photos every anniversary. What others have, my wife must have too." Jonathan kept his promise. Every wedding anniversary after that, he would take me to shoot a set of wedding photos and buy me a diamond ring. The diamonds grew larger each year, but the one I always wore was the first ring he gave me. Jonathan knew the significance of this ring for both of us, so he panicked. "Catherine, what are you trying to do? I know I might have sounded harsh, but what does it mean for you to give away our wedding ring?" I smiled. Jonathan is a man, and he probably will never understand the deeper meaning behind a wedding dress. The wedding dress Emily wore for the photos was something only a pregnant woman would wear. Her little scheme was evident, but only Jonathan saw her as a fragile little rabbit easily startled. Emily had been Jonathan's secretary for 2 years, and she was the one who made the appointments at the photography studio. She knew I would be there to choose photos, and she knew I would look at her moments. The studio owner's poor acting had already given her away. How could she let me see Jonathan's wedding photos with another woman? There was only one possibility: someone wanted me to see. I watched Emily, who was glaring at Jonathan with jealousy, prying his fingers apart one by one. "Jonathan, your Emily is probably pregnant, right? If you don't marry her soon, the child will be born out of wedlock. Let's get a divorce, I'll help you both." Jonathan was taken aback, shaking his head in denial. "What pregnancy? I don't know what you're talking about." I pointed at Emily. "You don't know? Ask your little secretary, she knows." With that, I turned around and left decisively. I didn't go home but instead went to the riverside alone. I had been in this city for 5 years, but aside from Jonathan, I didn't have any other friends. I had let love cloud my judgment and never thought I would end up in such a situation. I called a lawyer I was familiar with, telling her I wanted a divorce and that I aimed to secure the largest possible share of the assets. After all, without love, I might as well get the money. You have to consider both love and bread. This time, I chose bread. When I returned home that night, I was surprised to find Jonathan there. He was wearing an apron and brought out a pot of soup. "Wife, I made your favorite dish and cooked the soup you love. Hurry and wash your hands for dinner." On the table were spicy chicken, boiled fish, pig lung soup, and stir-fried garland chrysanthemum. I didn't pick up the chopsticks. "What's wrong? Is it not to your taste?" I looked at him, realizing he hadn't cooked in over a year. I casually said, "I've developed a stomach issue, so I don't eat spicy food anymore." Jonathan was momentarily stunned, as if remembering my stomach problems. He quickly scooped a bowl of soup for me, but I pushed it away. "I don't eat pig lung, and you don't need to serve me vegetables. I don't eat garland chrysanthemum either." I stood up. "You can eat by yourself. See, not loving you makes it so obvious. Your likes and dislikes, he will no longer remember. In the past, he would meticulously pick out all the scallions for me, but now, my preferences and aversions seem to be out of his concern." Jonathan stood up and grabbed my hand. "Wife, I'm sorry. Can you forgive me? I was just confused. I really don't have feelings for her. I looked at him, trying to find traces of the past on his face, but there was nothing. The Jonathan now was mature and steady, exuding charm and handsomeness in his every move. But he no longer had the sincerity and love he once had for me. I softly asked him, "Do you remember what you said during our wedding? You promised to treat me well for a lifetime and never wrong me, but you've forgotten all that." The Jonathan I loved only loved me. My heart is small and can only hold him. But now his heart is big enough to hold many people. Jonathan stood up, frowning as he looked at me. "I just made a mistake that every man in the world makes." I apologized. "Why are you still so stubborn? Why do you have to act like those petty, jealous women? Why be so narrow-minded?" I laughed mockingly. "If someone else makes a mistake, do you think you should make one too? Everyone dies, why don't you go die?" Jonathan's face turned red. "You're so cruel. Can't we communicate properly?" I spread out the divorce agreement and handed him the pen. "If you sign this, we can talk properly." Jonathan grabbed my hand, looking at me with the pleading expression he used to favor. "Wife, I really love you, please don't be angry. I can just fire Emily, okay?" I looked at him, staring intently. "Are you willing to never see her again? Including the child in her belly?" When we got married, Jonathan was at the startup stage, extremely busy. He loved me dearly and couldn't bear for me to suffer even a little. He told me he wanted to be a dink couple. At that time, he hugged me and said, "Having you as my baby is enough." But now he said, "I don't love her, but I need a child to inherit everything. She's young, healthy, and pregnant right now. Someone else bears your child, you don't have to worry about your body changing, is that not good? As long as you agree, when she has the child, I'll bring it back for you to raise. As for Emily, just give her some money." I looked at him in disbelief. "Does Emily agree?" Jonathan laughed, looking confident. "You don't understand her, she's a very innocent woman. She's with me only because she loves me. She said she doesn't want a title or anything, just being able to give me a child is enough for her." I almost burst out laughing. "Emily is an innocent woman? She only loves him? Doesn't want money or a title?" Now I realize Jonathan is the real love-struck fool. I pulled my hand away from his. "But Jonathan, I find you disgusting." I really wanted to know what would happen if Emily ended up with Jonathan and found out he had nothing after the divorce. Would she still say she only loved him? We parted unhappily. Jonathan was unwilling to sign the divorce agreement, and our divorce fell into a stalemate. I moved out of our home and began contacting a lawyer. Jonathan seemed to be trying to spite me by bringing Emily to various events. Emily updated her moments daily, posting various photos of herself with Jonathan and the various jewelry he gave her. She even pretended to post, saying, "He said I'm more precious than gemstones." Out there, some people were already calling her Mrs. Jonathan. I watched the video where Jonathan mumbled his introduction, while Emily replied proudly, leaving much to the imagination. I arranged to have afternoon tea with Mrs. Wang, the wife of our company's major client. In the past, Jonathan always entertained various clients, but maintaining client relationships involves more than just the clients themselves. It also includes various personal connections, like their wives. Over the years, I've become quite familiar with the preferences of every client's wife. I remember once, to secure a large order, I scoured the city to find the kind of small wontons that Mr. Lin had enjoyed as a child. The dish wasn't expensive, but the thought behind it was priceless. Mrs. Lin was moved as she ate the wontons and looked at me. "You really went through a lot to find this, it's hard to come by. From now on, all orders from Lin's will be yours." As for Mrs. Wang, when she had a miscarriage and Mr. Wang was on a business trip, I stayed with her for a week, preparing various soups for her every day. Jonathan thought he was exceptional but had no idea how much effort I was putting in behind his back. In this world, it seems that a woman's contributions are easily overlooked. While Mrs. Wang and I were chatting over tea, I accidentally spotted Emily walking into the hotel with a few of her girlfriends. They were laughing loudly. "Emily, when are you and Jonathan getting married?" one asked. Yeah, I see Jonathan looks at you like you're his precious jewel. It's so cheesy, another chimed in. Emily replied as she walked, we're still handling the paperwork. Once that old woman signs the divorce agreement, Jonathan and I will get married. She noticed me and paused for a moment before walking over. Sister Catherine, the expenses here aren't cheap. Jonathan works hard for his money. She glanced at Mrs. Wang with a look of disdain. You're still treating people to afternoon tea? This lady here, Sister Catherine, is currently going through a divorce, so you'd better stay away. After all, she won't be Mrs. Jonathan for much longer. The future Mrs. Jonathan is me. Mrs. Wang looked at me, raising an eyebrow. And who is this? I kindly explained. This is Jonathan's secretary and also his mistress. She claims she's pregnant with his child. So, I'm currently discussing divorce with Jonathan. Mrs. Wang had a disapproving look on her face as she regarded Emily. Catherine, you should be more vigilant. Men are prone to cheating, you have to keep a close watch. Don't let him bring anything dirty into bed, who knows how many hands he's been through. I feigned humility, saying, yes, I was too trusting. I didn't expect this would happen, even with a child involved. Mrs. Wang waved dismissively. How many kids do you want? Just throw some money at it and that's that. Let me teach you, having your own child is the best. If you can't have one or don't want one, just nip it in the bud so that Jonathan can't have any. Hearing our casual discussion, Emily screamed in anger. If you can't keep your husband, why blame others for taking his place? If a man's heart strays, you have to look at yourselves for the reason. After all, who doesn't like the young and beautiful? You should have self-awareness. If it's time to step aside, then do so immediately to avoid a messy situation. I stood up with a cold laugh. Miss Emily, I'm still Mrs. Jonathan. If you want to take my place, please continue to whisper sweet nothings in Jonathan's ear until he signs the divorce agreement. Otherwise, when your belly starts to show, it'll look quite bad for you. Emily was furious, and her friends coaxed her away. I felt unlucky and didn't want to bother with her anymore. When we were halfway through our tea, Mrs. Wang went to touch up her makeup, and Jonathan arrived. Emily rushed into his arms, crying like a rain-soaked pear blossom. Jonathan, Sister Catherine, she left her sentence hanging, causing Jonathan to furrow his brow as he looked at me. He supported Emily while glancing at me. I told you I must have a child, why can't you understand? I found it quite laughable. What does your need for a child have to do with me? First, get the divorce settled. I won't care if you have a child afterward. Emily shook Jonathan's arm. My stomach hurts. Sister Catherine just bullied me with that old woman. I don't understand anything, they keep calling me a mistress. I'm not. Jonathan, I just love you and want to give you a child, what's wrong with that? I couldn't be bothered to say another word and turned to leave. Jonathan forcefully pulled me back, his face dark. Do you really want to make this so ugly? Are you conspiring with outsiders to bully Emily? Is that really fun? Jonathan. Mrs. Wang returned. As soon as Emily saw her, she clung to Jonathan and acted coy. It's that old woman who bullied me along with Catherine. Jonathan's expression changed drastically, and he scolded her, shut up. Then he plastered on a smile to greet Mrs. Wang. Mrs. Wang, what a coincidence to run into you. Mrs. Wang waved her hand, pulling me closer. I invited Catherine for afternoon tea, but your little lover had to crash the party and make a fool of herself. Jonathan, I used to think you did business well, but now it seems your judgment is clouded. I can't trust you with my orders anymore. I'll talk to Mr. Wang at home about this year's orders and reconsider. Emily, feeling both humiliated and wronged, shouted at Mrs. Wang, if you don't do it, does that mean the Jonathan group can't survive? Jonathan, you have to back me up. Mrs. Wang laughed in anger. Well, you have some backbone. In that case, no need to reconsider, let's stop cooperating right away. After saying that, she grabbed me and left. Jonathan looked at the oblivious Emily and yelled in frustration. Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea how much Wang's orders are worth in a year? Do you know how much your one comment has cost the Jonathan Group? Are you crazy? Emily cried. She's young and doesn't understand anything. Why are you so fierce? When I got home that night, I saw Jonathan waiting at my door. The ground was littered with cigarette butts. He must have received the notice from Wang's company that they would be canceling the partnership. Jonathan saw me and hurried over, looking worried. Wife, where have you been? I stepped back. What's the matter? I was just worried about you. If you don't say anything, I'm going home to rest. Can you help me plead with Mrs. Wang? Jonathan pleaded. I turned to look at him. Plead for you? Why should I? What's in it for me? Jonathan gritted his teeth. If you can help me, I'll sign the divorce papers. I raised a finger and smiled at him. I want 60% of the assets. You're the one at fault, the original 50-50 split won't work anymore. Jonathan's face darkened. Don't push your luck. I shrugged. If you don't agree, then that's that. He thought about Wang's orders. For the sake of the company, he ultimately agreed. Jonathan signed the divorce agreement, and a month later, we received the divorce certificate. He stared at me with a gloomy expression. You promised to help me plead with Mrs. Wang. I put away the divorce certificate before answering him. I pleaded, but Mrs. Wang refused to forgive Emily. There's nothing I can do. You say that finding a wife brings good fortune, but why did you end up with a disaster? Jonathan was furious. You're playing me. I shook my head and chuckled. The Wang order was negotiated by me from the start. Now that it's gone, it's your fault. You're so capable, why don't you go find clients yourself? Emily was waiting for him at the entrance of the Civil Affairs Bureau. When she saw us come out, she rushed over and linked her arm with his. Jonathan, don't worry. I can do what Catherine can. Once I win over those ladies, won't we be able to secure these orders? I scoffed. Just you, Emily? Ha! The day after I received the divorce certificate, I sold all my shares in the Jonathan Group to a rival company. The thought of Jonathan's expression when he saw his competitor sitting across from him made me unable to stop laughing. After that, I pooled all my funds to start my own company, poaching employees from the Jonathan Group and making a big splash. In the same industry with the same resources, I thrived. When my company launched, Mrs. Wang came in person. She looked at the arrangement of my company and nodded in satisfaction. I don't have any gifts to give you, so I'll give you the Wang orders. You handled them when you were at the Jonathan Group, and I trust you to continue. With Mrs. Wang's endorsement, several former major clients of the Jonathan Group switched to my company. Suddenly, my new company was outpacing the Jonathan Group. When Jonathan called me, he sounded utterly exhausted. I didn't expect you to have no sense of loyalty as a spouse and to snatch my clients away, I replied with a smile. Jonathan, what loyalty do we have to discuss? These clients were developed by me from the start, it's only natural for them to follow me. Clients aren't fools, who would want to give orders to someone who's not clear-headed? After all, the industry knows about Jonathan's relationship issues. Jonathan shouted, Catherine. A day as husband and wife should mean 100 days of grace. Do you really hate me that much? Absolutely. As a cheating scumbag, what right do you have to talk about 100 days of grace? I hung up the phone with a bang. After that, I threw myself into my work, but they proactively came looking for trouble. My assistant rushed into my office, holding a phone. President Catherine, you need to see this news. The screen showed a photo of me coming out of the obstetrics and gynecology department, a middle-aged man following closely behind. The angle made it look like he was half embracing me. My assistant frowned, looking worried. News is spreading everywhere that you're engaging in improper means to secure business. This online troll has posted many of your photos and is making slanderous claims. President Catherine, should we clarify this? I skimmed through the photos and realized what was happening. This was clearly someone intentionally taking candid shots of me and crafting this kind of news to tarnish my reputation and bring me down. The only person who could do this was one person. I dropped my phone and shook my head. I'm on the right side of things, I don't need to worry. The online backlash spiraled out of control, and even my parents in City B were alarmed. My dad was furious on the phone. You got divorced and didn't tell the family, and now you're being cyberbullied and still didn't say anything. Do you still consider yourself part of the family? I felt a lump in my throat, my eyes stinging. Dad, I can handle this. Once it's over, I'll come home to see you. The next day, I went back to the obstetrics and gynecology department and unexpectedly ran into Emily at the entrance. She saw me and smiled with ill intentions. What a coincidence, Sister Catherine. Are you here for the obstetrics and gynecology department? You're not pregnant, are you? How rare, didn't they say you couldn't get pregnant? How come you're pregnant right after the divorce? Jonathan was coming out just then, holding medicine, and overheard her, looking at me with a complex expression. You're pregnant with another man's child? I coldly stared at them. What's it to you? Jonathan, you should keep your wife's mouth in check. Jonathan grabbed me. Are you really stooping this low just to make money? Can't you have some dignity? Emily exaggeratedly sighed beside us. Some women just choose to sink lower. Having a child with another man, you weren't a mistress before you got divorced, were you? I turned to glare at her. Do you think others would be as shameless as you? Emily held her chin up. I'm currently Mrs. Jonathan, and the child in my belly is legitimate. Unlike you, who doesn't even know where your wild child came from. Oh, what? Is that wild man not accompanying you today? Is Mrs. Jonathan referring to me? The man from yesterday's photo appeared behind her. I walked over immediately. President Ethan, how is Mrs. Ethan doing? I came by today to see her. The man in the photo was the famous Ethan, and I happened to be negotiating a business deal with him. Yesterday, I visited his home, but he wasn't there. It was Mrs. Ethan who welcomed me. I didn't expect Mrs. Ethan to be having stomach pains, so I took her to the hospital. After an examination, we discovered she was pregnant. Fortunately, we got her to the hospital in time, and the fetus was safe. President Ethan returned home that night, immensely grateful. When he escorted me out, someone Emily sent to follow me took photos and concocted a dramatic story around it. President Ethan looked coldly at her. Mrs. Jonathan, I think it's more important for you to take care of yourself. A venomous person like you is pregnant. Don't you fear retribution for your child? I introduced him from the side. This is President Ethan. Jonathan should know him, right? Jonathan's face turned pale in an instant, and he quickly bent forward to extend his hand. President Ethan, I've heard so much about you. I'm Jonathan. President Ethan didn't even glance at him, smiling at me instead. My wife is resting in the room and has been mentioning you. Please go in. Don't worry about those online rumors. Our group's lawyers have already gathered evidence, and will sue them all together. We are currently investigating the posters and the person who took the photos, and we will clear your name and let you vent your frustration. I smiled. Thank you so much, President Ethan. As I turned around, I caught sight of Emily's ghostly pale face. She must be having second thoughts now, but unfortunately, it was too late. After leaving the hospital and entering the parking lot, I saw Jonathan and Emily arguing. Jonathan shouted, "This is your doing. You dared to take photos of President Ethan? You really know how to get yourself killed." Emily shot back, "How was I supposed to know who he was? I saw him coming out with that cheap woman, so I had someone take pictures. When I sent them online, you didn't object, did you? Now that something's gone wrong, you blame me?" Jonathan pushed her away. "You'll admit it was your idea when the time comes. If the Jonathan group gets dragged down because of you, I won't go easy on you." Saying that, he opened the car door and was about to get in. Emily, crying, hugged Jonathan. "I'm your wife, and I'm pregnant with your child. How can you do this? Are you just going to watch me go to jail? But don't worry, the hospital is right behind us. It's still in time for anything related to preserving the pregnancy." As I drove past Emily, I rolled down the window and looked at her. "Mrs. Jonathan, why aren't you taking Jonathan's car? Is the passenger seat too uncomfortable?" I watched Emily's face turn red with anger, my tone becoming more gentle. Don't get mad, it might affect the baby. But don't worry, the hospital is right behind us, it's still in time for anything related to preserving the pregnancy. After saying that, I rolled up the window, hummed a tune, and drove away. President Ethan's legal team was very professional, quickly identifying several people spreading rumors online and directly suing them. The mastermind behind it all turned out to be Emily. When the police took Emily in for questioning, she saw me and thudded to her knees. Sister Catherine, please forgive me. I can bow to you, can't I? I'll pay you back. For the sake of the child in my belly, please let me go. I stepped back and looked at her. You need to apologize publicly online. You must come forward and clarify what you did. Otherwise, I will never forgive you. Emily's face turned red, but she had no choice but to agree to my demands. Her apology statement flooded the internet, and onlookers were delighted. This woman is the mistress. I thought everyone at the Jonathan group knew that. Even the ex-wife has divorced, she's still harming others. Is she even human? This woman looks familiar. Wasn't there a professor at our school who got fired for seducing someone named Emily? Same name. Because of Emily's actions, the Jonathan group was significantly affected. Some of her past scandals were dug up, making her a pariah. In order not to let Emily drag him down, Jonathan even decided to divorce her. I learned about this at the hospital while getting a checkup for my stomach problems. I unexpectedly saw them in the obstetrics and gynecology department. Because Emily was unwilling to sign the divorce papers, Jonathan had a heated argument with her, pushing her to the ground, causing her to go into premature labor. Emily's cries of pain echoed through the entire hallway, drawing attention. Later, I heard she gave birth to a daughter. She and Jonathan didn't get divorced, because after she was discharged from the hospital, she prepared a bunch of materials to report Jonathan for tax evasion. Jonathan got arrested. Emily refused to help him pay back the taxes, leading to him being sentenced. When Emily visited him in prison with their daughter, she wore a gentle expression. Don't worry about serving time, husband. I'll take good care of our daughter, please just sign the divorce agreement. Jonathan wished he could rush out and fight her. You've put me in this position and still want a divorce? Even if I die, I'll drag you down with me. Emily smiled coldly. You don't have a say in this, it will only take some time. If you want our daughter to bear the stigma of having a father in prison, then go ahead and delay. Jonathan looked completely defeated. He had lost everything, his daughter had become his Achilles heel. Emily's eyes were filled with hatred. She had a premature birth and suffered from massive bleeding. To save her life, her uterus was removed. She aged rapidly, looking like she had suddenly grown 10 years older. I wasn't concerned about what would happen to them in the future. Slowly, I shifted my company's affairs back to my parents' city. Perhaps one day, I will find someone I love again, perhaps I won't. But it doesn't matter because I am already happy enough.